Hello everyone, today we are going to cover mean, standard error, and standard deviation. Summary statistics are used to describe a whole statistical population with just a few numbers. What is a population? A population is a group that you are interested in studying. For example, the picture to the left shows a population of fish, the middle picture shows a population of plants, and to the right is a population of cells. There are two main descriptions of a population: the central tendency and the spread. The central tendency lets you know what does the middle of your distribution look like. What is the average or the individual in the middle of your population? For this class, this will be the mean. The mean is also the average. The spread lets us know if the individuals in your population are mostly alike or is there a lot of variation. That is also referred to as the standard deviation. The bigger the standard deviation, the more variation in your population. Let's take a look at two populations with the same average. The curve that is in dark black has an average of 0, and the other curve, the lighter gray one, also has an average of 0. Which of these curves shows more variation in the population? Well, let's take a look at the range. The range for the dark black line here is from -5 to 5, and so it's a range of about 10 numbers. Where the range of the gray line has a much larger range, so we're going from -15 to 0 and 0 to +15, so we have a range of about 30 units. The curve with the smaller range has the least variation, meaning that most of the population is closer to the average. And the second curve, the one with the larger range, has more variation in the population, meaning that most of the numbers are farther apart from the average. Which curve would have the highest standard deviation? Well, the more variation in your population, the higher the standard deviation. So which curve do you think that would be? Would it be the curve with the black line or the curve with the gray? So the more variation there is in your population, the higher the standard deviation. If you guess the black line here has the smaller standard deviation, you are correct because there is less variation within the population. And the second curve would have a higher standard deviation because of that. Let's take a look at the averages of two test scores. The same group of students took two different kinds of exams. They took a biology exam and a math exam. I would like to compare which exam was easier for the students. Was it biology or math? Or did they do about the same in both exams? In order for me to compare how the students did for both exams as a whole, so the students here are the population. In order for me to compare how they did as a whole, then I need to take the average of the scores, of the test scores. So I will be taking an average of the biology test scores and an average of the math test scores. The average is the sum of the data set. In this case, biology, the data set is 85, 76, 73, 80, 72, 84, and 79. I will add all of these numbers, and then I will divide it by the sample size. The sample size is also referred to as n. Whenever you see the letter n, just know that that means the sample size. In this case, the sample size is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 students. So here are the students. 7 students are the sample size, so in this case n equals 7. The sum of the scores of biology divided by the sample size of 7 will give me the average. Same thing for math. The sum of the scores divided by the sample size of 7 will give me the average. In this case, the average for each exam is 78 and 76. According to the average, it seems as though the group of students performed similarly in each test. However, we can dive in deeper and take a look at the variation within the scores. Was the variation close to the average, or was the variation more spread apart? So let's take a look at the individual numbers and make a prediction to see which exam had more standard deviation or more variation within the scores. If we look at the biology scores and look at the average of 78, we can take a look at each number and pretty much assume that they're not too far apart from the average of 78. It's about give or take plus or minus 3, just by looking at it. If I take a look at the math scores and the average being 76, I'll notice that some of the scores are really far apart from the average. For example, 34 is very far from the average, and so is 120. That's about 50 points away from the average, and this one too, 50 points away from the average. So it looks as though the scores have more variation because they spread apart even farther from the average. And so even though it seems as though the students performed similarly in each exam, in the math exam, it seems as though some students had difficulty where other students just aced it. And so they didn't all quite score the same according to the variation in the population. And so that is considered the standard deviation. The standard deviation is a measure of the amount of variation dispersed of a set of values. A low standard deviation indicates that the values tend to be close to the average, which is also called the mean. And a high standard deviation indicates that the values are spread out over a wider range. So let's take a guess. Which one of these which one of these exams have a higher standard deviation? The scores that are closer together, the ones that are closer to the average, or the scores that are farther away from the average? And remember, the higher the standard deviation, the more variation in the population. And just as a side note, standard deviation, the way that we calculate it, is by taking the average of each test score. So we'll do one at a time. So let's say we take the average of the math score, which is 76, and we subtract each data point and square that. And then you sum every single one. So every data point has to be included. And you divide that by the sample size. The good news, however, is that we will not do this manually. We will have Excel, which is why we need to know how to use Excel. We will use Excel to calculate the standard deviation for us. So there's no need for you to memorize this equation. You can practice it if you like. It's completely up to you. But there's no need to memorize this equation and no need to actually have to use a calculator for this class. Excel will do this for us. Okay, so have you guessed which one do you think will have a higher standard deviation? Will it be the scores for the biology exam or the scores for the math exam? If you guess the scores for the math exam, you are correct. Because every single data point here is much more farther apart, much more variable to the average than biology, and this is just by you looking at it, you can tell. The more variation you have and the more farther apart you are from the average, the higher the standard deviation. So that means that all of the students did not test the same. Even though the averages for both exam scores are about the same, all students did not perform about the same. So math was probably a harder subject or much more difficult because of the variation. And biology is, it seems as though all of the students have the same competency level, or they understand biology relatively the same, because they all scored pretty close to the average and the standard deviation is a lot lower. When we make a graph, for example, like a bar graph, we add standard deviation bars to give us a general idea of how precise a measurement is to the average, or conversely, how far from the reported value the true error-free value might be. For example, this bar graph is comparing different types of teaching methods. You have teaching method A, teaching method B, and teaching method C. Which teaching method do you think is the best? And which teaching method has the lowest standard deviation? Let's look at teaching method A. And so teaching method A has an average of about a score of 90. However, there is a lot of variation within this teaching method, meaning that some students did really well with this teaching method where other students didn't do so well. And so there's a wider variation, meaning that not all of the students learned in the same way. Same thing for teaching method B. Teaching method B is a little bit similar to teaching method A, but with less variation, meaning that all of the students performed about the same. However, teaching method C has a higher average of about 97 and a smaller standard deviation, meaning that most of the students learned in the same way. And so there is a meaning that if there's less variation, most of the students were either like learning in the same way or performing close or like performing almost equally, meaning that the teaching method is effective, especially since you have a low standard deviation. The length of an error bar helps to reveal uncertainty of the data points. The bigger the bar, the less reliable the data. Let's take a look at the error bars in this graph. Which of these bars have the largest standard deviation? If you said bar C, you are correct. The standard error bar, the standard deviation bar, shows that the individuals in the population are pretty far from the average. The more variation that you have within a population, the less reliable the data. And that's why in this meme it says, "Sorry, we can't just trust you." Meaning that the information that is being told in bar C is not reliable because not all of the scores or data points or the population is close to the average. There's too much variation within this bar. The other bars, regardless of what the score is, shows smaller standard deviation bars. And because of the standard deviation bar, that means that all of the data points or the entire population is very close to the average. And so the closer to the average the population is, the more reliable the data, and the more likely that it is statistically significant. And we'll learn more about statistical significance when we actually do different types of statistics, for example, like the t-test. There is one more type of statistic that we will always do in class, and we'll do this every single time we have a data set. We will calculate the standard error. The standard error is different from the standard deviation because the standard error represents a population, like a true population. And when we talk about a true population, for example, the true population size of humans is about 8 billion because there's about 8 billion people on this earth. And when you're using a small population, like for a study, you may only use 50 to 100 individuals. And so in that case, that would give you the information that is found in the standard deviation. And if you want to know how your experiment of that small population of a 50 to 100 compares to a true population, which is, let's say, all of the females on Earth or something like that, or all of the females that live in America or something like that, then you would calculate the standard error, and that would let you know how close your experiment is close to an actual real population. And I hope I didn't confuse you. So standard deviation tells us about the population of our own data, where the standard error tells us how good our estimate is as a measure of the true population. When we do experiments, we do hope to answer questions that represent a large population. However, we can't just experiment on everyone or every species or everyone in the population because of resources, because of introducing more error. And so there are many reasons why you can't just test every individual. But we can do statistics that can let us know, or that can show us how close we are to a true population. The way that we calculate the standard error is by taking the standard deviation and dividing that by the square root of the sample size. As our sample size gets bigger, what do you think happens to the standard error? So you'll have less error the more bigger your population, right? Because the bigger the population, the more closer you are to a true population. So if you have an experiment of, let's say, 3 plants, and you're trying to make a conclusion about these three plants about how plants grow in certain conditions, there's a good chance you have a lot of standard error in there because 3 plants do not represent a whole population of plants. If you have an experiment of 100 plants, then your standard error is a lot smaller because 100 plants is probably a closer estimate to what happens in a population than 3 plants. This is how the standard error equation looks like. And we will be manually inputting that into Excel, but it's easier than it sounds, so don't worry. We'll be taking care of that. And this graph shows that the standard error of the mean is a lot less variable, so it's a lot smaller the larger your population size is. And so this is an n of 1,000, and so you have less error in comparison to n of 30, where you would have more error. Okay, the variation would be larger. The take-home message for each is that the mean tells us the center of the population, the average. So what is an individual of this population like? The standard deviation tells us how variable our population is. If the standard deviation is large, individuals might be larger or smaller than the mean. If it is small, most of the individuals are alike and closer to the mean. The standard error is computed from the standard deviation, but they tell us 2 different things. SC tells us how confident we can be that our measured sample mean is close to a true population.